somber, quote. So with that said, Stephen, hi.
Hello there. It's good to be with you, Ethan.
Yeah, I'm really happy to have some time with you. But just in case you all haven't met Stephen before, or you didn't read the email, Mr. Antonoff, or Dr. Antonoff, I should say, has spent about 40 years thinking about college admissions and spent some time as the Dean of Admission and Dean of Students at the University of Denver. Wrote some books on this that are probably on your bookshelf if you're a counselor, or your counselor's bookshelf. College Finder, College Match, Student of Colleges. These are all books that are near and dear to my heart, some of my favorite resources. He teaches at the UC Irvine Extension program, teaches counselors how to do this whole counseling thing, and founded the American Institute of Certified Educational Planners, which we'll share a link to. This grants a credential for those who pass a board certification and meet ongoing requirements. It's really a pleasure to be with you as ever. So let's jump in. We've got, let's see, let me just check the results of our poll so far. We've got 35% parents, 40% counselors, 20% students, and 3% other. Folks are letting us know in the chat. But let's just start with the basics. So Stephen, why is college list building important?
Yeah, it's important because there is no college planning without colleges. And so the essence of college planning is really the identification of good fit schools. And we can talk about what good fit means, but that it's important because it is the essence, it is the center of college planning.
And what are some of the things that folks sometimes find difficult about the college list building problem? I was going to say problem, but process. I guess it can be sometimes a problem.
I think sometimes it is a problem. I think sometimes the beginning of the college search is done without thinking about all of the colleges that a student could get into. Mm-hmm. I believe that the beginning of the college search oftentimes is looking at the schools that a student might not get into. Right. And so it starts the entire search process on the wrong foot. And I think that's the first mistake, or the first problem that people have is thinking about those whatever number of schools that you can't get into. We know that generally most schools have admission rates of over 70%. So we can fixate, if we want to, on the 50 colleges or the 70 colleges, and granted, that number is increasing, but we can focus on that number and say, oh dear, isn't it a shame that I might not get into those schools? I think the better way to start is to think about the 3,000 that a student can get into and begin the search from that perspective.
So I love what you just said. And I just want to, for those in the balcony, I want to say it again. Most schools have an admission rate of above 70%. Why isn't this common knowledge? Like, why isn't this something that is out there? Like, what is this? What's going on that this isn't something that people are like, yes, of course we know that.
Yeah. Well, I hope that a few more will know about it because of your work, Ethan. I'm hoping that every one of us that gets a chance to talk about college admission or write about college admission makes that point, because it's very easy to look at it from the other side, to look at the cup half full. And that's that begins the search on the wrong foot.
Yeah, I love this notion of starting the process off on the wrong foot. Are there other ways? What are some other great ways of starting the process off on the wrong foot?
I think one of the other ways, and it's somewhat related to the first one, is overly focusing on prestige,
Mhm.
overly focusing on the name of the college. You know, as important as I think the name is, and obviously um, quality of one's educational institution is really quite significant. On the other hand, I think that too many students think about how the college is going to look on their resume when they graduate, as opposed to thinking about what those 4 years are really going to be like for them.
Yeah.
And that is a mistake. I think that as you're thinking about size and location and cost and all of the other important variables, you have to really think about, where is it that I'm going to be happy? Where am I going to thrive as an individual and as a student?
Yeah. Yeah. It seems like there is that narrow focus on those schools that we've heard of. And I think about, if I was only focusing on the schools that I'd heard of, I wouldn't have applied to a school like Northwestern, because I'd never heard of Northwestern until my counselor was like, you should apply to Northwestern. I was like, okay, great. What are some
these days you would definitely have heard of Northwestern. That's in one of, that's in the have category.
right?
But there are many schools like Northwestern these days that people haven't heard of. When you think about it, really, Ethan, what schools do people know about? They know about the Ivy League. I mean, that's in every movie that mentions colleges and so forth. And they know about usually the state university in their state. Beyond that, they probably, if their parents have gone to college, they probably know where they have gone, relatives, friends, and so forth. And then you have all of the students, all of the colleges, that are really well known because of their athletic victories. Look what it did, way back when for Boston College. Look what it's doing now for Gonzaga. These are good. These are good schools, but there are others that are as good that we just don't hear about.
Yeah. So how do students, when you think about the start of this process, what are some ways that students can set themselves up? It's March. Let's talk specifically to like rising seniors, students who are coming into the final stretch here of junior year. What are some ways that they can start to begin thinking about this process? And what are some maybe exercises that they can do to start thinking about their college list?
Sure. I think the first step is really to not think about colleges, but rather to think about yourself, to do a real inventory of who you are. Students are more than a GPA, more than a good essay, more than a test score if they've taken a test. You have to really begin the process by thinking about the characteristics that distinguish you from other learners. Are you a more visual learner? Are you someone who gets really frustrated if you don't get an A in a class? Are you someone who enjoys being around intellectual things and talking about those things a lot? Are you someone who is going to college just as much because of the experience as you're going for the purpose of being a student? There are some people who are going to college really primarily to be a student, and they want to learn as much as they can about as many different subjects as they can. Everybody wants to be a student if that means graduating and being successful in life. But what I'm talking about in terms of being a student is is the scholarly part, the academic part. And I think, there are 4.0 students on a 4.0 scale who are very academic, and there are 4.0 students on a 4-point scale who are less that way. So I do think that the process needs to start by looking at who you are, and there are lots of ways to do that. I provide a self-survey on my website, which is designed as a introduction and nothing more than a tool to help with this. Most all of the introductory admission books have some kind of a survey, and we could talk about other surveys, but to learn a little bit more about yourself. I love Ethan, your emphasis on values. I think, and in fact, one of my resources is also a values assessment. But I think to really think through the values that you have as you start on your quest for college is really important. Is it most important to learn as much as you can from a wide range of people? Is it most important to go where you're going to be able to graduate and make the most money possible? Are you going to school because you are wanting to save money for graduate school, which is a perfectly legitimate thing to do? So I think thinking about values, thinking about who you are, what your values are, what your interests are, is the first step toward developing a college list that makes sense.
Yeah, we're going to follow up with links to the specific things that Stephen mentioned. We'll follow up with them in email, so don't feel like you have to frantically Google or anything. We'll share these soon. One of the things that I think students are, and parents, well, counselors too, are concerned about is like helping students to figure out a balanced list. And maybe you could define what a balanced list is or looks like. And then I have a specific question from a counselor that came in recently who asks, with less emphasis on test scores, is it becoming more difficult to help students identify which colleges are, say, likely schools or target schools and reach schools? And how can we help students? How can we help ensure that their college lists are balanced with, when really we're looking at maybe, fewer things, more like looking more at GPA? So I'm asking two questions. One is like, first of all, what is a balanced list? And second, is it harder, do you think, to help students develop a balanced list with test scores, being less important?
I don't think it's harder to take the second question first. I don't think it's harder. I think that the best way to do this, and this is simplifying something that's a little more complex, but the best way to do this is to look at the percent of students admitted. I think that is probably the best way to gauge whether or not a college is a reach, a target, or a backup. In other words, if a college is admitting less than, let me say, 15% of the students who apply, that is going to be a reach school for everyone. It doesn't matter if you have a perfect ACT score and a perfect GPA, it's still going to be a reach. Obviously, a college that admits 20 to 50% might be in the target range. Again, there's a lot of different factors that play into this. Most colleges for most students are targets or backups, because most schools admit, as we've said, 70% or more of their students. I want to comment, if I could, Ethan, on the words that you use to describe these categories.
Please.
I think the words are awful, and I dislike them very much. I dislike using reach because it sounds to me like a dream. It sounds unreachable. It sounds like it's not going to be achieved. I prefer to say, for that category of school, I prefer to say low chance of admission school, because we're only talking about admission. We're not, we're absolutely not talking about academic quality or anything else that relates to the student experience. We're only talking about admission. Target isn't a bad choice, although I prefer medium chance of admission for the same reasons. Backup to me sounds like a booby prize. It sounds like a giveaway, something that is not worth attending, which is really not the point of that category. So high chance of admission school makes it clear that we're talking about schools that that you can get into, and hopefully also schools that you that you really like. The way I look at this broadly, Ethan, is, you know, if a B student with, let's say, 1,000 SATs, let's say the person through the COVID period was able to take the test, and the 3-point student got 1,000 and has average recommendations and average activities and so forth, that student is going to have at least 2,000 choices. So let's focus, as we were saying at the beginning, let's focus on those and try to find the best in that group for the high chance of admission category.
One of the things that we're going to talk more about in a couple of weeks when we do the course is the logistics of how do you find the specifics, like how do you find schools that are good for the things that you're looking for. But will you just give us a little bit of, because I know some folks are curious as they're watching this, how, with so many options out there, how does someone begin to even think about how to research schools? I mean, I imagine one person's thinking, well, do I just go to schools' websites? Do I talk to friends? Like, how does someone begin to sort, once they have some sense of what they're looking for, what schools are good for what, as it were?
Okay. That's a tough one. Let me begin by saying finding good fit colleges is very time consuming. I tell students that it's like an extra class in the second semester of the junior year and perhaps the first semester of the senior year. They've got to plan their time so that they have the hours that are necessary. I also feel like students with college planning need to look at it as if they were planning their exercise program or perhaps learning a new language or something. If one were doing those things, they would say, okay, I'm going to be doing this on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 4 o'clock to 6 o'clock or whatever it is. So the first thing I would say about finding a college is it's not easy, and it's something that is going to take time. It's something that students are going to have to think about. Talk to all the adults in their lives, people that have gone to college, certainly their counselor or their independent educational consultant. Those people are critical, but teachers even. students should ask, not necessarily for names of individual colleges, but just suggestions. If they had it to do over again, how would they go about the search? Beyond those general comments, you have some good national ways to identify colleges. Coursava is something that we're going to be talking about in the mini course. I think it can be very, very helpful. The qualities worksheet that I did for College Match, and which is available on my website for free. It's called Qualities, and again, I'm sure you'll make this available. Qualities that will make a college right for you. Getting an idea first about, in the case of Coursava, you've got must-haves and things that are important and things that are not as important. In the qualities worksheet, you are required to rank these to indicate which is more important for you. I think sometimes people who are going about the college search feel like they just throw everything down. Here's a size, here's a location, here's an academic major, here's my cost limits, here's this and that, without thinking about which is more important. So I do think that at some point early in the process, you've got to say, all right, cost is much more important than anything else. I simply am not going to be able to go unless the school is, and if it's a certain amount of cost, if it's if it has something to do with merit scholarship or the application for need-based aid, but you need to early on prioritize and begin to look at the things that are the most critical. You mentioned the school's website, sure. And there's never been more good information available to students. I really do feel like the virtual tours for students are better. They're not just sales pieces. Mm-hmm. I would be remiss if I didn't say that they are sales. Anything that is produced by an admission office, and I understand that, being a former dean of admission, that everything in an admission office is really marketing oriented. However, I do feel like the videos and other materials are better than ever. I think there are a number of other books and resources. I do think that the Fisk Guide to Colleges, and I know you have interviewed Ted Fisk, I think that the Fisk Guide gives a lot of really good information. I particularly like the paragraphs about campus life. I think they're much more valuable than the paragraphs about which academic programs are strongest. And other tidbits. I think that reading the Fisk Guide as opposed to looking at the numbers of stars for quality of life and academics and so forth is a good way to detect whether a school is right. And finally, I think that every student, you mentioned a second semester junior, I think every second semester junior ought to plan to have about 20 colleges on her or his radar screen by about the middle of the summer. In other words, build first. Don't eliminate, and don't hone in on one that's better than another or that you think would be better. Focus on coming up with 15 or 20 schools that make good sense. Finally, I'm sorry,
no, you're good.
I do want to add one other thing, and that is that students and parents should absolutely rely on their school counselor. If they have an independent educational consultant, it doesn't matter what the title of the person is. What you're looking for is a person who is a student of colleges. And you need to go to that person, seek help from that person, ask for resources. Most college counseling offices in high schools have, they either have programs or they have books and materials. That's a wealth of information valuable to most students.
Yeah. There's some good questions coming in from the chat. One is from Kanchan asking, how do you find these, figure out these non-objective characteristics about a school? Like, for example, whether its culture is quote unquote nerdy. And then a related question from Damari. Yeah. How do we assess things like the community of a school? So like how nerdy a school is, or what the community is like. How do students assess that?
Yeah. Well, if it was easy, there wouldn't be people like me who have spent years trying to learn and are still learning. So the first thing I want to say about that is that it is hard. However, there are good resources. I think that, well, I've already mentioned the Fisk guide. We've already mentioned using videos. There are also videos produced by organizations like College Vine and Niche that have videos and other materials available about colleges that can be helpful. You mentioned some of the non-objective or the objective factors. Some of the older materials, for example, the alumni factor, which is probably, it might be a decade old now, but that has some information that a lot of the newer guides does not have. I also think that the other college guide, again, an older volume. It was put out by Washington Monthly, but again, a lot of information about some of those discrete student characteristics that you don't find elsewhere. My book, College Finder, is also intended to help with that, because in College Finder there are lists, for example, lists of colleges for an outdoorsy student, lists of colleges for a scholar. You should know that volume is dated at this point. I am working on a new edition, and I hope that sometime in 2023 there'll be a new edition of that. But those are some of the resources. I also I know we have other things to talk about other than resources, but there's a book called Cool Colleges, and the one that I like is the original that was written by Asher, Donald Asher, I think. That has a lot of good information, particularly about more colleges that for a more quirky student. So those are some of the resources, and I'm hoping that in our mini course we'll talk about other resources, and that I'll be able to share a list of references that could be helpful.
Oh yes. Maitreyi is asking a great question. I'm going to change the phrasing on it just a little bit. And the question I want to know is, when is the right time to be thinking about cost as it relates to college? In other words, should I think about that right up front and do my thinking about college costs and then think about what I want? Or should I think about what I want first and then start thinking about whether or not I can afford these schools?
You should think about cost at the start of your search. And why not? I mean, if we were buying a car, are we going to just, if we were buying a car for our son or daughter who is of driving age, are we going to drop them off at the Lamborghini dealership, or the row of,
Right.
fancy cars that are extremely expensive? No, that would be ridiculous. The same thing with colleges. There are great value colleges. There are colleges that are worth what they charge. And there are colleges that aren't worth what they charge. And the question of worth is dependent upon what a person is looking for and what qualities are important in picking a school. But cost has got to be a primary consideration. And in my world, cost is always important. For a more well-to-do family, cost is significant because it may be, taking an extreme example, a college education versus a safari or something like that. So even in a family that is well-to-do, thinking about value, thinking about cost is absolutely critical.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And what are some of those, and this is not a session on paying for college, that was the last one we did, but what are some of those simple ways that even before students start to think about whittling down, creating that list of 20, that they can begin thinking about lists, they can begin thinking about cost?
Well, I think as you're looking at the 20 colleges, you ought to be making a list of what they charge. You also should look at the percent of students that are receiving merit aid. A lot of that information is available on collegedata.com and other places as well. But I think that making a chart, seeing the costs, if all of the costs of your 20 schools, this would be true, I think, for most students. If the cost of all of them are about the same, there might be a need to look at some lower cost schools. And lower cost schools, I think, Ethan, should be looked at not only, usually the in-state public university is a great option for in-state lower cost. But again, lots of colleges, if I were going to generalize, I would say that there are more value colleges perhaps in the southern part of the US. Again, not to generalize too much, but the Midwest, where you don't get as much value, is the places that everybody wants to go for a vacation. So, the colleges around San Diego and the colleges around New York and so forth are not going to generalizing, but are not going to typically be low cost.
How many, I know that the answer, I can anticipate what the answer is going to be, but I'm curious to see what you're going to say. How many schools should I apply to if I'm a rising senior? And then again, a second question, has that number changed in your mind over the years in terms of the advice you give on this?
I would say, well, I do think it depends. I do think that there are students with a narrower profile of what they're looking for, that you're maybe not going to apply to as many as I'm going to suggest in a moment. But for most students, I think that number these days is probably 10 or so. That's a lot, and maybe too many. But I have found in the last couple of years, given the erratic nature of college admission, given the lack of test scores being used as commonly as they were, given the changes in merit scholarships at different schools, I think that 10 or so allows enough variation so that when someone gets to March or April of their senior year, that they've got some good choices.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Cool. I was expecting the it depends, but is that always like, did you used to recommend fewer schools, or has it always kind of been in the 8 to 10 range? I'm just curious.
It used to be, I used to recommend less. I think, when I started, I think the average was something around 5 or 6, but that was many years ago. And the system, given the common application and the coalition application, it's easier to apply, which doesn't mean you should just apply wildly. Clearly not. But the system allows for a few more applications. Of course, there's also the matter of costs, and for many students that I see, they have difficulty applying to 10 schools because the tuition, the application fees are so high.
Mm-hmm. I want to open it up now for Q&A a little bit from y'all listening. And I want to solicit in particular, if there are counselors out there who have difficult questions, I want to see if we can, this is like a weird twisted game that I'm playing on you, Stephen, now, but I want to solicit difficult questions and see if we can, find some nuanced stuff. Part of this is just, I think it's just such a treat to be here with you, but I'm curious if there's like some specific things that counselors you've had in the back of your mind that you're wondering about. As we do this, I want to just remind folks that this course that we're talking about, it's not like we're trying to do this big sale. This is a pay what you can course. And what that means is the finances is not a barrier here. So anybody, whether you're, a student or counselor, you can sign up for whatever rate you want. There's a suggested cost, but we want you to make use of these resources. So we hope you'll join us. We've got a comment from a Law, I believe that's Claire Law, suggesting that students' MBTI personality type can guide students to college majors and fields of study, and says hello, which is, by the way, there's a great book on that. If you search MBTI, I forget the name of it. Do you know the name off the top of your head? I'll find it here in a second.
I should. It's right here on my shelf.
On mine too. Claire, you're going to get a shout out here. Oh gosh, it would take me too long to find it. Claire, you can let us know, and we're happy to give you a shout because that's
right.
such a good one. It's another great resource for helping students as they develop lists. Right. So, I want to make sure that I've gotten some of the questions that came in earlier. Here's a good one because we do have a bunch of international students on. How are students? You've kind of answered this a little bit, but how can students really get a feel for campus if they're not able to visit? You mentioned potentially doing these virtual tours. Maybe that's the full answer, but is there a way that particularly international students, maybe even, international students who are low income, how do they get a feel for all these campuses in the US?
Again, it's really a matter of using all the resources that you can get a hold of. Yeah. There are so many subjective guidebooks. There is a lot of material available on the web, both done by the colleges and by other groups that are in this industry or in this space. I think that talking with um, current students, talking with, I think most colleges, if you call the admission office, and this is certainly true of smaller schools, but if you call the admission office and say, I can't visit, I'd like to talk with a student, frequently they will make a student available. Oftentimes, one's counselor or independent educational consultant will have the name of someone who maybe has gone to that school in past years, so you can get information from that source. Quite honestly, Ethan, there was a point, and I want to say this with some qualifiers, but there was a point where I felt that not visiting was a positive in terms of the whole college planning process, because I was seeing so many students who would go to visit and have some judgment, either good or bad, that was not based on anything other than the weather or the look of the tour guide or the new gym or something like that. So I do believe that visiting is really important, but visiting is important only if you do the visit correctly. If you talk to enough students, if you go beyond the group information session and beyond the tour, talk to somebody in the activities office, talk to somebody in the security office, talk to people, talk to different faculty members, as many students as you can talk to. Ask them what they have learned about the school since enrolling that they didn't know before they came. Those kinds of things can be really helpful.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Here's one from AJ. Our top in-state schools here in California are so impossible to get into. Where do I steer my students with cost sensitivity who deserve to go to a highly selective school? For example, one of my current seniors with a 4.5 GPA, varsity sports all 4 years, started musical each year, tons of APs, didn't get into the UCs, UCLA, Cal, UCSD. So any advice?
It's a, I feel badly for that student. I mean, that's really that's sad, and that shouldn't happen. I'm not sure that I have any advice that this counselor hasn't already thought of. I do know that there are places that are in the for example, in the Western Undergraduate Exchange, that might be out-of-state options for students. There certainly are colleges that are lower cost around the country. The other thing I want to say is California has probably the best, or at least one of the best, community college programs in the nation. And I do think that all of us in college admission tend, including myself, I think, to look down upon or think that that's not a good option for some students. But I can tell you so many success stories of students that I have worked with who, for cost or other reasons, started at a 2-year school, transferred, had only 2 years to pay for a 4-year education, had many more options after going to school at a community college for 2 years. So I do want to throw that option out as well.
Let's talk to parents for a few minutes. If you had to, in the spirit of like those cartoons, sort of angel and devil on the shoulder, if there was a Stephen Antonoff shoulder advisor that you could install on the shoulder of parents, what would you say to them as they think about how to support their students through this process?
The first thing that I think of here is to let the student lead the college search process. We are not going to college. The student is going to college. And while parents have a tremendous interest, financial and otherwise, in finding good choices for their son or daughter, they also have to let the student go and let the student find those good options with your guidance, with your perspectives. I think talking about cost, talking about location, talking about other things with your son or daughter early on is really important. I think there's a lot of mistakes, a lot of myths. Location, I think that if students aren't careful, they think of location as picking a vacation site as opposed to picking a place where they're going to go to college. Other things that I think parents can do is to, as much as possible, make it possible for the student to visit, again, if possible at all, and to set the limits. Maybe it's, we only can make one trip during the whole college planning process. If we can't make a trip, I'm willing to buy these books or buy these subscriptions that might help you. I think that's extremely important. I think also that parents should realize that not every student is able at 16 or 17 or 18 to know what they want to major in. Mm-hmm. I think that parents ought to be okay with some ambiguity. Now, I think that parents should help students, as I think counselors ought to help students with resources for careers, resources for occupations, and so forth. But I do think that that to expect that someone is going to know is an expectation that not all students are able to achieve. I would also mention to parents not to use U.S. News as the Bible of college planning. I find that there's a use for U.S. News, and I have it here, and I show it to families. But the notion that number 30 on the list is better than number 32 is just completely nonsense. It may be what, if you're looking at national liberal arts, maybe the top quarter is a little bit different than the next quarter, but over-reliance on U.S. News would be a major mistake. And finally, I would say, above all else, as you're thinking about your student going to college, where are they going to be happy? Where are they going to be around people that they enjoy, that they are learning from? Where are they going to be pushed and not shoved? Where are they going to learn more about the world? And finally, I want to say that the landscape of higher education just in this country, forgetting about all the great options in Europe and Canada and so forth, the landscape of options is tremendous. Uh-huh. Take the time to look carefully.
Kristen asks, homeschooling has increased by leaps and bounds in the pandemic. What kind of advice do you have for non-traditional students? How do they build a list of colleges that are welcoming to homeschooled students?
I think the same way as we've talked about in other categories. I think just with the homeschool, you're looking at some of the some different variables. I find that there are lots of different motivations for homeschool. Learning about why someone has decided to homeschool their daughter or son can be helpful in terms of identifying appropriate colleges. Sometimes, we may be looking at schools that are a bit more religious, or schools that are a bit more conservative, or schools that are more liberal, or what have you. But I think learning about what the reasons for the homeschooling can be the start of finding good colleges for homeschooled students.
When you're talking to a family and you hear or you sense that there's what we'll call brand name bias, this is a question from Carson. What are some of your favorite go-tos to sort of unhook folks from obsessing over brand names? Like, are there certain phrases that you'll use, or things that you'll say, or stories that you'll tell to get folks sort of thinking about non-brand name schools, let's say?
Well, one of the things that I like to say is that there are only 0.3% of students that will end up attending an Ivy League college. Now, that may be very appropriate for Buffy or for James or something, but if you're a consumer and you're only looking at 0.003% of the options in a category, that is very limiting. I think I would also mention, as I did a few minutes ago, the car example. If they're going to buy a car for their student, they're not going to just look at Mercedes and Maseratis. They're going to be much more looking at a wide range. And finally, I would say this: when you think about matching a student to a college, and match to me means where you're going to be pushed but not shoved. Match means where you're going to be encouraged to think about yourself and others and the world. And as I've mentioned, where you're going to be happy. When you think about those things, if you think that there's only a small subset of colleges that meet those characteristics for your child, you're not thinking broadly enough.
I love that. I'm actually going to end on that. I mean, I feel like that's a great final bit of advice. Thanks, Stephen, for your time, as ever. I appreciate you.
I certainly appreciate, Ethan, the opportunity to share these comments and to work with you. So thank you.
Awesome. Well, friends, counselors, parents, students, we hope to see you in 10 days or so on the mini course. We'll follow up with details on that. Remember, it's pay what you can. I want to make sure that that's super clear, because sometimes folks are like, well, is that really real? And it's like, yes, it's really real. So we hope to see some of you and connect with you over the next couple of weeks. And if not, we'll see you around. We'll see you on another webinar sometime soon. Thanks, y'all. Have a beautiful rest of your night. Bye.